One thing, the panel is a very engaging panel. We just spent a couple of hours with students at the Eggers Cafe, so I hope we haven't talked them out. And I think they'd be interested. It's not a huge, overwhelming group. If we could quickly go around and introduce ourselves as to your name and why you're here. And John Burdick's here. Why don't we start with you, John?
I'm John Burdick, professor in the anthropology department. I'm here because this I find a very important topic and I'm interested.
Well,
I'm Marge Default, and I'm in the sociology department. I do some research on work, and also think these are important issues. And I also grew up in Wisconsin. So
there you go.
I'm especially interested in this topic.
Matt Huber, I'm in the Department of Geography and faculty. I also think it's a really important topic. My name is Robert Furor. I'm also in the Department of Geography. I think it's just a really important topic. Also, I do research on unions in Canada and the United States.
Thank you.
Greg Snyder, graduated undergrad from here. Now I'm actually back as staff, enrolled in Professor Merchant's complex studies course. And also, it's kind of an important topic to me too, because my wife just finished doing 3 years of teaching in New York City. And now I'm trying to get a job. So.
I'm Ben O'Connor. I think we've met before. I'm an MA/IR student here, and I'm interested in this. Also grew up in Wisconsin. Have some connections there.
My name is Richard Koleski. I'm not associated with the university. I'm a retired public employee. I work as a caseworker for Onondaga County, but I'm also associated with the Citizens Action Group, which does advocating for public employees and other issues regarding citizens.
Great. Well,
I'm Diane Jean. I'm a psych major in undergrad here, and I actually have a presentation to do on education for Writing Certified. So I saw the email for this, and I just decided.
that's great.
Take copious notes. You'll have your presentation done.
Join us.
And I'm Cecilia Green. I'm a professor in sociology, and I think it's an absolutely critical subject. Looking forward to it.
I'm Joe Thies. I'm a freshman here, and in my high school in New Jersey, Chris Christie had an attack on all the teachers. So I got to see that firsthand. It was pretty bad, so I want to see like this way to solve it at all.
Okay, great. Just come and join us around the table. There's lots of chairs.
I can stay for a
Well, that's okay.
That's okay. Well, I'll look at you when you leave.
I'm Karen Ogle, and I'm a graduate student in public administration.
Hi, I'm Paul from Myanmar. I'm a Humphrey Fellow. I'm studying at the MASLA School of Public Administration. So this topic is very related to my interest of this.
I'm Catherine Gerard. I'm director of PARCC. I spent the first 13 years of my career in state labor relations, and frankly, it's been shocking to see how the public perception of unionized government workers has shifted in 13 years. I find it appalling, and so I'm really interested in hearing your perceptions on it.
I'm David Dempsey. I'm an ENPA student with Professor Merchant, and I'm not from Wisconsin.
My name is Nashi. I'm IR student, and I also have a class with Professor Merchant and with Professor GERHARDT as well. And I come from Hungary, so I hope to take home some knowledge from this course and talk today.
I'm Maddie Burrell. I'm a junior music ed major here, but as an education student, I don't feel like we talk about unions enough. So I'm going to learn about it.
I'm Gretchen Purser. I'm a professor in sociology, and I'm very concerned about unions and help put this panel together. So
I'm Jen Bundy. I'm a freshman here. I get extra credit for going to things.
An honest woman.
And I grew up in Rhode Island, where the view of unions is, or at least, I don't know, my perspective, are they're viewed in a really bad way. So I guess it would be interesting to hear what everyone else has to say.
I'm Bill Kelleher. I'm a professor of anthropology here and interested in generally in work and labor issues.
Ross Rubenstein, professor of public administration and international affairs, and my main area of interest and research is education policy.
My name is Mandela Effiong. I'm a civil engineering student. I'm actually taking Professor Hubert's class. We don't get extra credit. I'm just here because it might affect me in the future, and really I just want to hear what's being said about the topic.
Great.
I am Peggy Pendergast. I'm a doctoral student in the School of Education, Teaching and Leadership, and my research is around this area of interest.
Terrific. And the lady that just joined us?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I'm Jessica Bacon. I'm a doctoral student in special ed, and I'm doing my dissertation on how standards based performance affecting special ed, and there's a lot of discourse around teachers.
Terrific. Great. Well, thank you all for being here. Let me give you a sense of what our process will be. I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists. You can clap when you want to, but basically I'll introduce them once. And then we're going to take them sort of in order. Rebecca GIVAN is going to give us the broad picture of the situation with public employees. And each of our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes. Would like to take questions at the end, and we think it really helps us get our information to you. And then, so if you have a burning question, write it down. You know the drill, right? And then we'll hear from, hold on, Douglas GERHARDT, second. I know that. We've spent a lot of time together, but already. I don't think he's as forgiving about my age. And he's funny, too. And then Pauline Kinsella. So in that order, we're going to speak and offer you information, and then we hope for a good dialogue after we've made those presentations. So it is my pleasure to introduce this panel. Rebecca GIVAN is, she joined the ILR school as an assistant professor in August 2005. Received her PhD in political science from Northwestern in 2004 and a BA from Oberlin College in '97. Prior to joining ILR, Professor GIVAN held positions at Cardiff Business School and the Center for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, where she is still a research associate. Good excuse to go to London. Her research has appeared or is forthcoming in publications including Industrial and Labor Relations Review, British Journal of Industrial Relations, International Labor and Working Class History, and Public Administration. She is the editor with Kenneth Roberts and Sarah Soule of The Diffusion of Social Movements. She teaches in the areas of labor relations and international comparative labor, including comparative welfare states and healthcare systems. Her research and publications focus on employment relations in the healthcare system in the United States and United Kingdom, and she's currently completing a book manuscript on the challenges in that industry. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. Douglas GERHARDT is a partner in the law firm Harris Beach PLLC in the Albany area, practicing in the area of labor and employment law with a particular expertise in education law. Mr. GERHARDT represents school district clients of the firm throughout New York State. His scope of practice is quite diverse, representing and counseling school districts in all manner of education and employment law matters, including court and through a variety of administrative proceedings. In addition to his practice, Mr. GERHARDT is also an adjunct professor of law at Union College's Graduate School of Education, where he has taught education law for many years. He is also president of MASLA, which is the Management Advocates for School Labor Affairs organization in this state, a professional association of labor advocates working with and for school districts throughout the New York State. Prior to coming to Harris Beach, Mr. GERHARDT was general counsel to the New York State Council of School Superintendents, and before that a union attorney working for the School Administrators Association in New York State. This latter experience gives him the unique perspective of management, having worked for labor. Thank you so much for joining us. And then lastly, Pauline Kinsella is the Executive Director of New York State United Teachers, NYSUT. She has been doing that for 10 years now, and prior to that, she was the chair of the Public Employment Relations Board in New York State. Quite a position, really responsible for all labor relations under the Taylor Law in New York State. But from her current position, she continues to oversee field services, where she has been responsible for supervising approximately 150 field staff in the union's 16 regional offices and headquarters. She has helped oversee negotiations, grievance administration, training, and other services provided to NYS its locals, and helped oversee staff training and development, along with directing NYS its organizing program. Okay. She's also an attorney, which I think is important to note, and was a partner with Reamer and Featherstone in Albany from 1979 to 1987, and law degree from Boston and Brown undergraduate. So thank you as well, Pauline, for joining us. I want to turn it over to Rebecca GIVAN to start us with this broad picture on public employees.
Thanks. And I'm just going to sit down and talk unless you tell me that you can't hear me. So let me know those the furthest away. Thanks to Chris and Gretchen for the invitation and for organizing this. And it's really nice to have such a diverse group of people and experiences in this room. I think that's really great, and I hope we have a heated discussion. My job is to set the scene, which means potentially the least exciting part before the gloves come off or whatever else is going to happen. So I'm trying to strike a balance between not spending too much time on the driest material, but also giving us enough of a common context that we have some sort of basic language and concepts in common. So that's what I'm going to try to do. What I want to do, Chris told me don't assume any particular background in labor relations. So those of you that do have a background, I hope will bear with me when I go through a few of the fundamentals. But I'm going to really go from big to small. So I'm going to talk about what collective bargaining is, and then what it is in the public sector, and then talking a bit about the specifics of teachers and education. And talking about some of the current challenges, the different interest groups that are at play. So I do this many times in my lectures. I start with definitions. I can't help myself, and I frequently go to the Oxford English Dictionary. So what's collective bargaining? So the first apparently use according to the OED was 1923, which is actually crazy because those of us who think we know what collective bargaining is could identify it much earlier than that in history, but that may be the first time it was used in print that the expert lexicographers found, at least. And fixing the terms of employment by means of bargaining power between an organized body of employees and an employer or an employers association. So that's pretty basic, bargaining, negotiating. The important part is that the employees are organized together. They're collective. That's what makes it collective bargaining. And then this definition is from a common industrial relations textbook, and actually basically says the same thing. Organized groups of workers resolving conflict and pursuing common interests. That's a little bit aspirational, I think, or trying to allow for more partnership-based collective bargaining. But it's the same idea, even that fairly recent textbook definition. Quickly jumping to public sector collective bargaining, those of you who have studied any kind of labor history, labor relations, probably focused a lot on the Wagner Act, the so-called Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which established the National Labor Relations Board and was amended by Taft-Hartley in 1947. So that's what we think of when we think of the Wagner Act and Taft-Hartley as the core of law governing collective bargaining in the private sector. Public sector at every level, employees are not covered by the National Labor Relations Act, and there are some other groups like farm workers, domestic workers, other groups that are also not covered by the National Labor Relations Act. And one of the things that's sort of a side note, but I think one of the talks in this series may have talked about excluded workers. I don't know if you use that terminology, but when we talk about excluded workers, which is becoming very salient now, we're usually talking about workers excluded from both the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. So that use of the word excluded is becoming more and more frequent. So some workers were excluded, but most private sector workers were in there. So there was no public sector collective bargaining codified at that point. There was public sector collective bargaining in some areas, especially in the Postal Service, but it wasn't officially sanctioned or enabled. Executive Order 10988, signed by President Kennedy in 1962, brought collective bargaining to the federal sector. Now, some people here have held federal sector jobs. Collective bargaining in the federal sector is very interesting because you can bargain over all kinds of things except for wages and benefits and essentially conditions. So you can basically bargain over everything except the really good stuff, which means that there is collective bargaining, but you spend an awful lot of time talking about things like grievance procedures. You don't get to talk about wages or pensions or many, many, many other things. So it's very constrained, but it's there, and that was a big breakthrough for the public sector unions. When that federal executive order happened, many of the states followed suit. So there was a proliferation of collective bargaining in the states from the early to mid-60s. Now some states, like Wisconsin, poor Wisconsin, had led the charge much, much earlier in allowing public sector collective bargaining. But the bulk of the states that have it now, it came about in the 60s, where public sector workers were able to form unions, and their municipality or their state employer had to recognize and negotiate with them. So the big growth happened from the 60s, although there was some public sector bargaining before that. And that executive order was essentially codified in a Civil Service Reform Act in the late 70s. And that, among other things, in the federal sector, there's also no strikes are illegal. I should have said that, as well as bargaining being very constrained. And in the states, what you get is a whole variety. Just because there's some kind of enabling legislation, it could be set up in any number of different ways. So, influenced by the change in the federal sector, in the 60s, there was a flood of enabling legislation. I'll give the concrete example of New York State in a minute. But the enabling legislation covered things like mandatory, permissible, and illegal subjects of bargaining. That basically said you have to bargain over certain things, you may bargain over certain other things, and then you may not bargain over certain other things again. We may come back to some of these issues that matters when it comes to education. So you may have to bargain over pay. You may be allowed to bargain over start time, let's say, what time of day you start, and then you're not allowed to bargain that you can't let people of a certain race into your municipal facility or whatever it is. That's extreme. There are other things that are illegal subjects of bargaining because the states wanted to leave them to the legislatures, for example, that aren't something as extreme as that. But and then state bargaining laws also cover things like which groups are allowed to bargain collectively, which groups are treated differently. So many, many, many states have one set of laws for most public employees, but then a different set of laws for teachers and a different set of laws again for police and fire. So that's a pretty common division. Police and fire in one category, teachers in one category, and everybody else in another category. So these state laws could set that up in any number of ways. I'll use the New York State law as the example. The Taylor Law passed in 1967. If you have any questions, ask Pauline. It allows public sector collective bargaining. In other words, the employers have to recognize the unions when they have the majority of employees in the group. They have to bargain with them. It creates PERB, the Public Employment Relations Board. That's basically the simplest way. It's not a perfect description. Is the National Labor Relations Board for public sector employees in New York State. It's not a perfect way to describe it. Some of the things PERB does, a lot of the things PERB does is mediation and arbitration, reaching agreements, but it also can work on issues like defining a bargaining unit, things that would also come up in the private sector and would be dealt with by a National Labor Relations Board agent of some kind. The Taylor Law sets up certain kinds of impasse procedures for certain kinds of disputes. I want to keep that vague because some of that changed over time. Some of that was not in the initial law, but later passing the law. And the more you get into it, the more complicated it is because cities are allowed to have slightly different procedures. So if you look at New York City, which you might because it's very heavily unionized and there's a lot of activity, you would see certain things that don't seem to follow the state law, and in fact they don't because the city's allowed to set up its own rules. But one example, and this is later, not in the initial law, would be do you have binding arbitration for any groups that can't reach a collective bargaining agreement? And there is only for police and fire, correct? And I would say there is binding arbitration in a highly untimely manner in most cases because it takes so long to get to that point. There's a series of steps of mediation and et cetera that you have to get to even be at that point. And the Taylor Law, the reason people sometimes know about it is that it prohibits strikes. It makes strikes by public sector workers illegal. Not only that, it defines the penalty. The penalty for a worker who goes on strike is being docked 2 days' pay for every 1 day of work they missed. There are also some other penalties that go along with that, including losing checkoff of dues payments. So usually a union member gets their dues deducted from their paycheck every month. If the union has an illegal strike, they'll lose that. Number of other penalties that go along with that, including potential criminal penalties for the leader of the union. The leader of the Transit Workers Union in the 2005 strike was jailed for some time because of exactly what's laid out in the Taylor Law. So that's sort of my brief, what is collective bargaining and what is it in the public sector and in New York State. We can certainly come back. I know I'm going through a lot of this quickly, so let me know if I need to slow down or clarify anything. What I want to do is just put out some numbers. I think it sounds like a fairly well-versed crowd, so this may be familiar to you, but public and private sector union membership, this is in numbers, this is not percentage or proportion of the workforce. So for about 3 years now, public sector union members have outnumbered private sector union members. And I don't know, I'm not in the business of speculating, but it seems like that trend will continue, or the private sector certainly isn't about to come back above the public sector. So public sector union members have sort of-ish been rising in number, not very quickly in recent years, but the private sector union members have been falling quite quickly. So that's why you see that. So I think it's important when we're thinking about who are union members, more of them are in the public sector. When I have this on my own computer, I can tell you what all those states are, but the next slide I will tell you what all those states are, although I may test your eyesight. I just wanted to show the spread of public sector union coverage by state. That top state on the top left, anyone want to guess what that state is?
New York.
New York. Anyone want to guess the bottom state? That's harder. Georgia, close. So that just gives you an idea of the sort of spread from very, very high to very, very low. But let me tell you about the states. Testing your eyesight a little bit. These are in order of public sector coverage, so they're not alphabetical or anything else. And one of the reasons I displayed the data like this is because you see I have those red public sector line bars in order, and then the blue lines don't exactly track, right? So that's the private sector coverage. So some are high for both, like New York, and some are not so high for both. In those states that we think of as fairly anti-union states that still have, you might find it surprising that a state like Georgia has over 10% public sector union coverage. Remember that those are likely to be almost all federal employees who live in Georgia, right? It doesn't mean they work for the state of Georgia or for a municipality in Georgia. Those are Georgia residents. So we can assume, and in some of the southern states, there might be things like civilian employees for Department of Defense on military bases, that kind of thing. So we would see numbers of federal employees who would be eligible to be in unions. And this graph is union coverage. So this is people covered by a collective bargaining agreement. So that's just sort of a sense of the variation, which is large, and also the ways in which public and private membership don't perfectly track each other. I thought I should put up a picture of the right to work state. So right to work state is a state that makes it harder for private sector unions to organize by saying that people who choose not to be in the union don't have to pay a fee for the union services that they still get. Where it's not a right to work state, that means a union can negotiate what they call an agency fee, and that fee, some of you have seen this if you've been union members, that fee is for the services that the union's giving everyone in that bargaining unit, so representing you in a grievance, negotiating on your behalf, etc. And so those red states are all the states where it's harder for private sector unions to organize because they're not allowed to negotiate an agency fee, and those are the states with lower unionization as a result. And then Indiana I put in purple because it just switched over. So that's that. And then I'm going to put up a few graphs, which I hope are pictures, which I hope are helpful. But I thought it was good to see. This is generally before a year and a half ago. We would have said this is the map of pro and anti-union states. Now we have many more ways of looking at it. So let me show you. Already got my slides out of order. Let me talk a little about the new limits on collective bargaining. What has been happening since essentially that large conservative state level influx in November 2010, obviously with Wisconsin leading the way, but with many other states, especially Midwest Rust Belt, but not only, sort of hot on their tails. I'm going to come back and talk more about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, but we know that this organization, it's technically a nonprofit, corporate funded, covers a huge number of issues. ALEC's agenda was partly about diminishing worker rights in the private and public sectors, attacking public sector bargaining, and I'll show some more specific examples, but that was something that was clearly rising to the fore after the November 2010 elections. And the targets included public sector bargaining, teacher tenure, other areas included the voter ID, stand your ground laws, etc. So there were a number of areas that had little to do with worker rights. And if you want to know more, ALEC Exposed, I think it's actually .org, has all the documents that you could spend all the hours in the day on. So what are the targets of the new restrictions? This is again some of those terms. Mandatory and permissible subjects of bargaining. So in Wisconsin, they actually weren't outlawing bargaining. They just said you can only negotiate wages up to the level of inflation. You can't negotiate pensions. You can't negotiate anything, in fact, except wages, and that can only be below the level of inflation. So that's one example. Dues checkoff, that's what I talked about, getting your dues to be deducted right out of your paycheck. That's an administrative nightmare if unions have to persuade their members to either make a monthly bank transfer or write a check every month, rather than the employer being willing to take it out of the paycheck, which is usually something that they negotiate at the bargaining table, and that says, no, you can't negotiate it at the bargaining table. That agency fee I mentioned, that's that fee that they can charge people who are in the bargaining unit who they have the duty to represent, whether or not they choose to be a member. That was one of the targets. Teacher tenure and dismissal protection, I'll come back to because I'm going to give much more concrete examples. And then right to work in the public and private sector. So the Indiana law was about changing right to work in the private sector, but in Ohio and to some extent in Wisconsin, there were attempts to basically replicate right to work, but for public sector workers, and more. There's a lot more stuff that we can come into as it comes up. So where did we start? This is the situation in 2011. States with no public sector collective bargaining are the red, and minimal are the pink. Wisconsin, it's sort of reflects the partway through the Wisconsin attack, so they're sort of minimal. But what you see, I think, could be initially surprising when you look at a state like Texas. Texas has very, very strong restrictions on collective bargaining, but does allow it for police and I think firefighters. So some of the states with minimal, the same I think is true with Georgia. Some of the states with minimal, a lot of that is just police and fire and nobody else, but they don't outlaw it. And some of the states, North Carolina and maybe Virginia have it as actually part of the state constitution, not just the law. That was the sort of the starting point with some states, and so you could say all those white states were ripe for ALEC's influence to come in and say let's chip away. And in fact, what you get is this set of states, which kind of looks like the inverse of the other map, where there have been proposed restrictions to public sector collective bargaining. I want to be very clear on what this map does and doesn't do. Even now I look at it and I think, well, it doesn't perfectly reflect everything, so I'm drawn to New Hampshire. New Hampshire, there's been a right to work issue, but it's private sector, so that's not up there. But for the purposes of making this map, I define things very broadly, so it could be anything from a tax on teacher tenure to something like what happened in Wisconsin and Ohio, where they're really trying to move public sector bargaining just completely out. So it's any kind of limiting public sector bargaining rights, and as kind of broadly defined. But that gives a sense of just how widespread it's been. Just trying to say you could define it slightly differently and get a slightly different map, but you got to draw the line somewhere. So let me talk a bit about the American Legislative Exchange Council. What I wanted to do is give examples of how it actually works. What ALEC does is it writes model laws in a huge number of areas, and then it invites state legislators to its conferences at very fancy resorts. It gives them a quote-unquote scholarship, so it's not giving them any money, they're just going to learn. And they go to these resorts, and they sit in rooms with the corporate members of ALEC, and they talk about the issues, and at the end they're handed a packet, and that's got a law in it, and then they can just cross it out and fill in the blanks and hopefully submit it in their states. Now these are state legislators that may not have a lot of experience and may not have a lot of resources. So it's not like they have 8 lawyers that can write up a law for them, right, working in their office. They might have 0 or 1 staff members. So, and what has been found, the Center for Media and Democracy has done a lot of work in exposing ALEC, and it was able to obtain copies and publicize all these model bills, which is very useful because now we can compare them. So, and some of the most prominent bills combined several ALEC-initiated ideas. So this is just one example. I'll go through a couple. In Ohio, the Right to Work Act was the ALEC model law, and this is part of Ohio SB 5. SB 5 in Ohio was the bill that passed, was really draconian limits on collective bargaining, and the union movement threw all of their resources into Ohio and were able to get it overturned. So that column on the right is the law that did pass and was rapidly overturned. But you can see that the point is the same and the language is similar, even though it was put as part of a larger, broader law in Ohio. The same kind of idea is there as a condition of employment, continuation of employment. It's all very, very similar. So that's the right to work piece of it. The next example is possibly a little hard to read. I could distribute this afterwards. This is basically making public employee strikes illegal. Any strike, picketing, boycott, or other action by an employee organization is hereby declared to be for an illegal purpose and is a violation of the provisions of this chapter. And then anyone who violates it on the right you see is subject to various sanctions. And importantly, the penalties, it's a misdemeanor, so making it a crime to go on strike, that was an important piece of what ALEC was trying to push. So you would actually end up with a misdemeanor on your record if you went on strike. So that's a pretty radical departure. So moving then to education, some of us had lunch and talked about this. ALEC has a lot to say about education. the model law that I wanted to talk about that I think affects the kind of things we want to talk about today the most is the Great Teachers and Leaders Act, which has to do with evaluating teachers, and it says that they should have performance evaluations for teachers, and it says, and New York State is not complying with this desire, but at least 50% of the evaluation determined by the academic growth of the students, right? So there should be teacher evaluations, that's point one, and then point two is the academic growth of the students. That means usually some kind of a test score improvement. In New Jersey, I don't know if anyone said they were from New Jersey, but this was great because the New Jersey School Children First Act used very, very similar language and procedures to the ALEC Model Act, and the governor has consistently denied that there was any relationship at all. It just must be a big coincidence. So one example with New Jersey was just the ratings. ALEC wants highly effective, effective, ineffective, and more if needed, and sure enough, highly effective, effective, partially effective, and ineffective. So those have become pretty widespread in a number of states, but it's pretty clear that ALEC's sort of fingerprints are on there. I wanted just to say a little bit about just cause dismissal and teacher tenure. When a teacher has passed their probation in most states, they have the right to keep their job, or when and if there's a possible dismissal, they have the right to be dismissed only for cause or just cause. It's very, very common in all collective bargaining agreements. You can't be dismissed for no reason. The employer has to show cause. So in the case of teacher tenure in New York State, there's a hearing that's demonized by those who are upset at the teachers' unions, called a 3028 hearing. It doesn't matter, it's just a hearing to determine whether a particular penalty is appropriate and whether the person actually did what they're accused of doing. The education reform movement has really targeted this tenure system and wanted to weaken it so that it's easier to dismiss a teacher. The ALEC-inspired legislation requires annual evaluations and with dismissal of teachers rated ineffective for 2 consecutive years. Not every state that has moved in this direction has had the absolute dismissal after 2 consecutive years. They've sometimes done it their own way. And just to give you an idea of the different relationships between some of the education reform, I think education reform has become an almost meaningless term because it's used sort of for opposite things as desired by the person using it. But I did pull up some information from the National Council on Teacher Quality. That's one of these broad education reform nonprofits. Michelle Rhee, who many of you have heard of, was on their board for some time. A lot of money from the Gates Foundation, the Eli Broad Foundation, some of the foundations that have been putting a lot of money into public schools, but also frequently speaking out publicly against teacher unions as the cause of the problem. And one of their areas of priority is what they call exiting ineffective teachers. I think exiting is I always get on my students when they write sentences with no agency that are completely passive. So the idea of exiting a teacher is not what I would like someone to write. But exiting ineffective teachers, and they have these 4 reasons that these teachers should be exited. So closing licensure loopholes, if they're unsatisfactory evaluations, too much, again, poor classroom performance, and then reduction in force. That's a little confusing. That's actually an anti-seniority preference that they're saying. They're saying when there's a reduction in force, it should not go by seniority, it should go by something else, performance. So those are their sort of sense. And then the last thing I'm going to put up is their evaluation of how it's going. The colors, I use their map here. So the colors are kind of confusing, but that dark black is they meet the standard for exiting ineffective teachers. Blue is nearly meets, and then it doesn't go from dark to light. But the meets and the nearly meets, you might be surprised to know that New York nearly meets, and it might reflect pretty recent activity in the legislature. I would say if this map were made a year and a half ago, they wouldn't say nearly meets their goals. But you see this sort of does not meet is actually the majority of the country, right? Does not meet. They don't have those policies in place for non-seniority based layoffs, for measuring performance, etc. So this is the reason for showing this is both to show the goals of an organization like the National Council for Teacher Quality, how they fit with some of the goals of ALEC, but then also to see how much diversity there is across the country in any sense of moving or not moving in that direction. And I think I'll just leave it there.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Now let's turn to Douglas and your presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate being here, and I think this is a very engaging topic. I appreciate the multidisciplinary field that we have before us, and hopefully I can synthesize in a few 15, 20 minutes or so some thoughts. I'm an attorney. My firm represents probably 100 school districts around New York State, from as far west as near Niagara Falls to all the way out on the eastern end of Long Island, which I tend to only go to when it's wine grape season. I have restrictions there, and in the summer I'll go to Amagansett or one of those because they're in the Hamptons. But I tell you that because I have a broad spectrum of these issues from the standpoint of being a practitioner. I'm at the negotiating table, I'm in hearings, I represent school districts in grievances, I represent school districts in litigation. So I come to you today, I guess, as the requisite management guy in the crowd on this issue of public employees. But in bringing that perspective, I want to also tell you that I started my education career as a union attorney. I worked for many years as the council and legislative director of the School Administrators Association, which is an employee association representing the principals of New York State, 5,000-6,000 principals around the state. Many of you, based on where you are now, probably have been called to the dean's office or the principal's office, and those are the people I represented. I actually had the privilege of once representing the dean whose office I was called to once, and I will proudly tell you I talked my way out of detention then, and I think did a good job representing him 20 years later. So I have that perspective. I have stood in the legislature arm in arm with NYSET, advocating for not changing laws related to tenure. I've also sat in the legislature representing superintendents and management, advocating for changes. So you may look at me now and say he's a chameleon. He's a real lawyer. He can advocate whatever he's paid for, and maybe both of those are somewhat true, but I rather say that because I want to explain that I have a perspective, I think, from both sides of the union perspective in the education field. So enough of that. You can believe my resume, disregard my resume, take it for what it's worth, but I hope that in telling you that, I'm hoping I tell you at least that I bring a complete perspective to this, and I think somewhat of a measured one. I'm not some crazy management attorney who thinks management's always right and unions are always wrong. I think in order to delve into this topic, I want to look at our flyer for this, and I think, well, before I do that, I think, at the outset, I want to set forth a universal truth that I think, without even consulting Pauline, she will agree with, which is we all, on the management and union side, want good teachers in front of kids. We want kids learning. We want kids achieving. And we don't want bad teachers in schools. So I ask you to accept that as a given. EN, not AN. Nobody got that.
I got it, but I might have heard it before.
And I think that's really true. And every time I go to the negotiating table and every time I go to a hearing, we always keep that in mind. And it's for the kids, it's for the children. But the truth is, we really want good education. And frankly, we're lucky because in New York we have really good education. I think what may be up for debate a little bit is the impact of unions on education. And again, now I'll turn to the flyer here, indicating a couple things that public sector workers are under unprecedented attack. that salaries and pensions have been cut in the name of fiscal austerity, and the battle is spreading to other states. I think you all saw the eye-catching clenched fist. Does everybody know the clenched fist? And I think that it's a wonderful, catchy graphic. I'm a little surprised that nobody came here saying I saw the catchy graphic and wanted to be here for that. But that's a symbol of resistance in the face of violence, and I would submit that it's a little over the top. And you may disagree with me, but it is over the top, because that's not where we are with unions in New York State. But more importantly, it's inaccurate. Unions are not under attack in New York State. They aren't. Public sector workers may feel like they're under attack, but they're not. And I think the easiest way to explain what I mean is think of a balance sheet. And I'm an attorney primarily because I am not great in math, so I didn't do a lot of accounting, but I know assets and liabilities. So look at the one side of the balance sheet in education, the asset side of it. And there are essentially three components to that side of the balance sheet. In other words, how are schools funded? Schools are funded through federal aid, state aid, and then local money. Federal aid is we can sort of slot that over here in this silo and leave it there. It kind of happens every year. It's targeted to specific programs. You don't really lose a lot of federal aid every year. It typically stagnates. So it's always kind of there. It's also not a huge amount of a school district's budget. Look at the state aid. State aid for many years, and this is when you pay your income tax, which you all better have mailed at least by yesterday, because you got a grace for Patriots Day, but you should have mailed it by yesterday. When you pay, and maybe you got refunds, incidentally, I hope nobody was one of those people that DiNapoli held up your refund. Did you see that? The comptroller of New York State held up like 5,000 people's refunds. It was terrible. Anyway, your personal income taxes pay and help support education. That state aid to education from the New York State legislature governor from the state goes to schools, and it's parceled out through a complex set of formulas that don't really matter, but you get state aid. Typically, what we have generally in school districts figured is we'll get the same state aid this year, last year as we got the year before. It doesn't go down. That mantra worked pretty well. And when you need a little bit more, you raise taxes. So the budget's kind of always incrementally moved up in school districts, and the state budget over the years has incrementally moved up. So we always could count on that. That's really no longer the case. In that second category of assets in schools, that state aid, state aid money is actually not something we can be guaranteed to get every year the same. And in fact, this year has generally been viewed as a very good year for state aid for school districts. In other words, a lot of state aid flowed to school districts. You probably saw a lot of articles. The Syracuse papers tend to be very good about covering that. What they may not have covered is the fact that 80% of school districts in New York State this year received less state aid than they did last year. Well, what does that mean? And I'm reaching the point where it's like almost an econometrics class where you're getting bored because it's aid stuff. But what I mean is, those districts are now saying, okay, I got less state money. The federal money is about the same. State money is not as much. Now how do I make it up? Well, that third category, local money, will raise taxes. Well, you all now know that there's now a cap on the amount that we can increase taxes in the local school districts. That cap is now imposed for the first time for the 12-13 school year. And that's creating a problem on the asset side of the balance sheet. Federal aid stagnant for the most part. State aid, maybe it's less, maybe it's a little more, but if it's less, I gotta make it up. How do I make it up? Taxes. I'm limited in doing that. Where do I go? Well, I may need to now shift over to the other side of the balance sheet. That other side of the balance sheet is, where am I spending my money? And one of the absolute truths in education is that most money is spent on salary and benefits for employees. It's not on pencils, it's not on paper, it's not on computers, it's on labor costs. We are a high labor cost state to start, and the highest cost in school districts are labor costs. So when you look at who's being paid in schools, the large portion of people being paid in schools are not secretaries and custodial workers, they happen to be teachers. And we like to pay our teachers a lot because they do a really good job. And we want them to do a good job and we want to pay them as much as we can. But when you look at, we have limited resources here. I've only got one checking account, 2 savings accounts, and they're not moving, and I got to pay all these costs. What do? Well, I have to figure out ways to keep paying those teachers. I have to pay them by contract. So what are the choices? Sometimes the choices are laying off teachers. Sometimes the choices are getting rid of programs. I had the good pleasure of meeting a state trooper this morning. And he told me that his wife, no, I didn't get a ticket. I didn't tell him I was a lawyer, but I didn't get a ticket. But his wife is a teacher. She's a music teacher. She also has only been there in that school district for 4 years. And he was nervous she might lose her job. He was actually telling me he's happy that it appears as though she will not lose her job this year, but maybe she will next year. The point I'm making is when schools are forced to make tough choices because they have these costs, what they have to do is figure out how to reduce those costs. Layoffs are the worst thing they can do because it reduces what kids get in the education system. But the fact of the matter is, getting back to where I started with this, public sector workers are under unprecedented attack. No, they're not. No, they're not. Schools, and I'm very, very disappointed in all of you right now who have been taking notes and you've stopped. I want you to write that down. They are not under attack. You're not going to get credit. I'm going to call your professor. You're not taking notes. You should take notes too, because you could be a civil engineer in a public sector job. They're not under attack. School districts are trying to figure out how to make that balance sheet work. And in order to do that, they are either worst case scenario, looking at layoffs, best case scenario, going to the negotiating table and looking for how we can fix things, how can we adjust things. Salaries and pensions have been cut in the name of fiscal austerity. Well, I think that's somewhat, I'm troubled by the language in there because it sounds as though it's in the name of fiscal austerity, but wink and a nod, we really know what it is. It's an attack on the unions. No, it's fiscal austerity. I told you what the 3 ways that we get money to schools is, and those 3 ways aren't continuing to increase. There's also tax fatigue. Even if we could raise taxes, we're not going to get people to vote for it. Because the law does allow more than a 2% increase in taxes if you get 60% of the vote. Interestingly, although we get 97% of school district budgets being passed annually, on average, 90, 95, 97% pass, do you know how many pass with 60% or more of the voters? 20. No, they just don't. So that's not really a reality. So are they being cut? First of all, salaries, let's talk about pensions for a minute. Pensions can't be cut. Okay, so you should write that down too. Because when you see that in the paper, or when you drive south on 787 from Troy to Albany and you see a billboard, and the billboard has a picture of an 8-year-old looking, don't I deserve a pension? Say no to Tier 6? Ignore that. Because you cannot, by mandate of the New York State Constitution, eliminate pension or reduce pension benefits for employees. You can't. And that is exactly what the unions have said, and this is, well, I won't pick on the unions. I'll simply read a quote from Danny Donahue, the head of the CSEA union, regarding Tier 6. CSEA will also use time to consult with our brother and sister unions and other allied community organizations about how we can collectively address the disrespect and disenfranchisement of working people in our state's by our state's elected officials. New Yorkers should understand that lawmakers' actions did not result from meaningful debate and good judgment. It resulted from political expediency, and it will have harmful consequences to people and communities now and for a long time to come. Really? Really? Giving me a defined benefit in a pension is going to have long-term consequences? How many of you have defined benefit plans? I don't. Quiet down. Quiet down. I was going to pay you off. What happened when they enacted Tier 6 this year was those who are not in public employees, but may be in the future, like the 8-year-old on the billboard, and I'm not making that up, if they become public employees in New York State, will enter a new tier of the retirement system, which will have benefits that are different than those that currently exist for current employees. Current employees in New York State in school districts are members of Tier 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. All of those have different benefits. All of them were enacted at different times. And they will not change for those people who are currently in them. So it is an absolute fiction that we can diminish pension benefits for public employees. We can change them for those who may become public employees in the future, and that distinction is critically important. And when the claim is made that unions are under attack from Tier 6, no, they're not, because the people who are affected by Tier 6 aren't even in unions yet. Salary can't be reduced either. We don't reduce salaries of teachers in school districts unless it is collectively bargained. And it is a rarity, if not a non-existence, that we would ever reduce the salary of teachers. We may ask them to take a freeze in salary. We may come to the bargaining table and say, would you please forego a raise next year so that we cannot increase our labor cost for a year and help us with our budgeting? But we can't even get that unless there's an agreement at the table. So I think it's important to remember that. Am I having a disagreement with whether we can do that?
Not saying a word.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm waiting my turn.
So again, an important concept not to lose sight of, and I think in the context of talking about unions and whether they're under attack, yeah, are individual school boards going to the bargaining table asking for more? Sure, I've done it. I've gone to the table and said, look, I don't want to give you a raise next year, and I need your help. You'll get the same salary you got this year, but I don't want to give you a raise next year. And the union, certainly it would be great if they will agree, but they don't always agree. And something that Professor Givens didn't mention, and maybe it's too nuanced or too detailed, but one of the elements of collective bargaining agreements in New York schools is a step schedule, where basically every year that a teacher works, and maybe I'm explaining something everybody's very familiar with, but every year a teacher works is another step. So when you move from June 30th, 2012 to July 1st, 2013, you move up on a step. You've been there additional year, and each step essentially has a new salary for you depending on what level you're at. Bachelor's, master's plus certain credits. So when you move up on step, it's an automatic increase in salary because you've moved up a step. The argument that another year of teaching, you're more experienced, you deserve more, fine. That's just sort of the nature of how these things have evolved. One of the problems with that is those step schedules remain in place even if we don't negotiate a new contract. Give you an easy example. Yesterday I found out one of the districts we represent, who we came to a settlement at the table on a contract with, the union voted down the contract. In other words, the negotiator said, okay, we agree, this is a good deal, so we go and try to settle this, and the union voted it down with the comment from the union came back and said that the union membership felt it could not do this to its families. When they move up on step, they're going to get a 3.5% raise as of July 1st, just because of the step schedule. But they couldn't do that to their families. That's a problem for management because it's difficult for us to, unless there's assent, unless there's willingness on both sides to come to some agreement on these terms, it's difficult to get to an agreement. And it's not, and something that I think is important to say on this is, it's not a happy day for a management committee of negotiators to come to the table and say, look, we think the teachers here are doing a great job. You really are. Kids are achieving, things are great. We don't want to give you a raise. Because it's really not we don't want to give you a raise. It's our fiscal constraints are such that we feel we can't give you a raise and keep all of you. So that's a dynamic that happens and plays out. Now, is that anti-union? I don't think that's anti-union. It's just, again, sort of a fiscal reality. So I think in looking at this, I think that this is an interesting topic, but I would be cautious to agree with the issue at hand that, I'm glad there's a question mark after public employees under siege, not public employees under siege. It matters because I would submit that they're not. I would also submit that regardless of what may be taking place in Wisconsin, I'm not seeing a legislative movement and frankly, I will confess and I apologize, I have never been to Wisconsin. I've driven across the country several times, but to go through Wisconsin when you're driving across the country is a wrong right turn. So I just didn't do it. But I like cheese. In New York, unions are not under attack. The change to Tier 6 was, again, not an attack on unions. It was simply something that long-term will assist. And the comptroller of New York State, Tom DiNapoli, even said that. He said, while this change in the pension system may be a good thing, it will not see the effects financially for a generation. And he's right, because those entering the system aren't really going to be accruing those benefits for quite some time. So we're really not going to see that for quite a while. Another point I think is worth parroting a little bit. Professor Gibbons touched on this, is this idea of agency shop. When you enter a school district as a teacher, you don't have a choice whether you're in the union. You're in the union. You are in the union. So we are a very union-oriented state. Now that may be debated, because I will be told at some point today that that's not true, and we have an agency shop situation where you can ask for your you don't have to join the union, but you get the money back that's used to pay for political activities. But you pay the dues up front, and then you ask for the reimbursement afterwards. You are a member of the union effectively, and the amount of the agency shop fee is de minimis. You pay whatever, $300 a year to be a member of the union. I don't want to be a member of the union. Okay, so here's your $12.68 back, or whatever. I mean, I'm making an exaggeration to make a point, but it's really, we are a unionized state when it comes to our schools. One last point, sort of generically, again, looking at unions in schools, and I don't know if this is good or bad, it's just an observation. I think that NYSET, as the union representing the teachers in New York, does have a difficult job, because it does represent, as I started, professionals. Teachers are professionals. They have bachelors, they have masters, and having taught at least one elementary school class, I will assure you, they have a far tougher job than I do. So they do a professional job, they are treated as professionals, but when it comes to some of the labor issues, they're forced to act as a union. And that sometimes conflicts with being a professional. That doesn't mean professionals can't be in unions, that's not what I'm saying. It means that the issues that are addressed from the union standpoint and the professional standpoint sometimes do not converge very effectively. We were discussing at lunch this idea that certain things just aren't negotiable, like curriculum, codes of conduct. Well, I would submit, so what? We're professionals. Let's sit down at the table and talk about how that curriculum should be developed. The fact that it's not mandated by the contract doesn't mean we can't have a mutual consensus on how curriculum should be done. And I think what I've seen in districts is when that does happen, and it happens very effectively in schools. So I'm seeing, I've taught long enough to know that I've talked long enough. So what I would end with is, again, where I started, which is with the caveat that I reserve time for rebuttal. Thank you, Your Honor. I will end where I started, which is, I think we have some of the best teachers in New York State. I think they're doing some of the most innovative teaching in New York State. I think that there are a lot of examples where management and unions, employees and unions can come together and do really good work. I have been a part of that, and I will also tell you I haven't led that charge. It's the great leaders of school districts that tend to lead that, and great leaders of unions that do that. There are stumbling blocks, and I don't see enough effort to address those, but you should walk away from this. What's the one thing that I'm going to pick on you because you're getting credit. What's the one thing you learned today? From me.
The public sector is not under attack.
Public sector unions are not, that's right. Public employees are not under siege, that's right. All right, well, I will end there, and again, hopefully we'll have a few minutes for comments and questions.
You're an honest man. Are you going to tell us what that fist got you this morning?
Huh?
When the policeman pulled you over, what was on your?
Oh yeah, that was on. This was on the passenger seat. So he does one of these. Can I see your license? What's that? I'm not kidding. And he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I don't know if I want to tell you." That's how we got into the conversation about his wife being a teacher, and we left it at, "Please yell at me, don't give me a ticket," and
yeah.
He said, "Consider yourself yelled at."
Okay. Thank you very much. And lastly, Pauline Kinsella.
There's so much to
So
say.
much.
So little time. And I really, really don't want to cut too far into the dialogue. I really want to want to hear questions, and we all want to hear questions and engage in dialogue. So I will be brief. I do disagree, and Douglas and I have known each other for probably 35 years or so.
Something like
that. And I can tell you that I do disagree very much with the proposition that public employees are not under siege. They are, in my opinion, and I think that there are many, many reasons why that's happened. It's not happenstance that school districts are underfunded currently, and that public employees are being asked to make wage concessions, and whether it's in school districts or in municipalities or at the state level. The reality, in my estimation, is that there is a concerted effort in this country to privatize public services. There is a concerted effort in this country to cut back on taxes for corporations and the wealthy, and to, by doing so, essentially starve the public sector. And I believe that that's true. I believe that is not happenstance, that state aid has been reduced to below the level that it was in 2008-9 for school districts. And it is not happenstance that there is simultaneously a property tax cap, which is the most draconian property tax cap in the country at this point in time in New York State. And so it's not an accident that school districts have lost funding, and that the public sector is losing positions dramatically. You saw Rebecca's. You saw the chart that showed that there's some decline in the public sector workforce in recent years. That's a trend that's going to continue. I assure you, that's a trend that's going to continue. And in fact, the unemployment rate in this country at this point is largely driven by the elimination of public sector positions. So when I say that public employees are under siege, I think that the evidence supports it, certainly from a financial standpoint, and then moving on from there in terms of policy making around public employees. We know that privatization of public services is a major watchword. It's not just, it's at the federal level with the military spending for private sector providers for food service and transportation and all sorts of other things in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It applies certainly in the public sector where environmental conservation initiatives are supposed to be self-policed by companies. It applies in food service and food inspection, where there's reduction in the food inspection and it's supposed to be self-policed by food providers. And it certainly is true in school districts where bus services, food service, and so on are being privatized in many, many places. So I can, from the standpoint of where are we with respect to the public sector workforce, it is declining in numbers, and it's going to continue to decline in my estimation. The interesting piece of this, from where I sit, is that the rhetoric related to reductions in the public sector workforce and reducing taxes and so on is that public employees are overpaid, their pension benefits are too rich, they have health insurance. How obnoxious is that they have health insurance, and that in fact it's essentially the fault of the public sector workforce that the economy is in the state that it's in. It's a brilliant maneuver by Wall Street to have taken the stock crash of 2008 and pivoted into an attack on the public sector workforce to say that it's the fault of the public sector that we have the economic problems that we have at the present time. That is just, it's a brilliant maneuver. And it is not a maneuver that is coincidental or unconscious, it's deliberate. So from where I sit, from my standpoint, public employees are indeed under siege. The fact that we have the Occupy movement in this country is also a factor from where I sit in the attacks on public sector and private sector unions and the opportunity to unionize. The reality is that we have a greater wealth gap in this country now than we did 40 years ago. or 50 years ago, and it is not a coincidence that the labor force, the unionization of the labor force, has declined during that period of time. They go together. And I would argue that the 99%ers who are occupying Wall Street and Boston and other places really haven't made a connection, in my view, between their situation, being in stagnant wage positions, high level of unemployment, and diminished benefits, the loss of defined benefit plans in the private sector, the unavailability and unaffordable health insurance. These are things that are being faced by the 99%ers and have been facing for many, many years. What I'm curious about is whether and to what extent the Occupy movement will begin to focus on the fact that it's a non-organized workplace situation in the private sector that could potentially make a substantial difference to the trends that we're currently seeing in terms of the wealth gap and unemployment. I think that the reality is that we are going to be in a situation where we're going to continue having a downward spiral in wages and benefits unless people in workplaces begin to organize and begin to seek through bargaining, through peaceful means, a greater share of the wealth in this country. So those are certainly some things that I would look at as sort of big picture items. Speaking specifically about public school teachers, the teachers in this country are under attack, in my opinion. They are being blamed for all of the ills of our society. Education is being blamed for the ills of our society. We have a high dropout rate among poor and minority students. We have issues relating to the level of skill and knowledge that our students are leaving school with, and there is no doubt that the blame for that is being placed squarely on the shoulders of teachers. I think it's very sad, but the reality is that education is touted as the means to pull people out of poverty, but on the other hand, poverty makes a quality education and being able to take advantage of a quality education so much more difficult. So we are in a situation, I believe, where teachers are under attack, and the process of collective bargaining, which seeks to provide support for teachers and the institutions in which they work. And I would argue very clearly and specifically that from our standpoint as a union and as a union that represents professionals, we believe that there is absolutely no conflict between representing our members' needs, working conditions, wages, and benefits, and trying to helping them to try to improve the institutions in which they work. They work together, they have to work together, and frankly, in the public sector, we've been aware of this for a very long time because it's a lesson learned, frankly, from the private sector union movement, where in the private sector, unfortunately, the opportunity to be engaged in the thinking and planning and decision-making related to improving the products produced in this country have helped to lead to the diminution and demise of so many private sector unions. So we've learned that lesson in the public sector. We've learned that lesson in the teacher union movement and are committed to improving schools, school districts, higher education facilities, and all of the other institutions where our members work. Rather than devote too much more time to talking at you, what I'd like to do is just mention that with respect to unionization of teachers and the role that teacher unions play, there's no doubt that in other countries that have the highest level of academic achievement, according to whatever standard you want to use, the teacher workforces are completely unionized. Finland and Germany are two important examples of the top performers according to whatever standardized tests are being used. Similarly, in this country, the states which have the highest level of academic achievement according to Education Week analyses, which is an achievement, a student achievement research database, the states that have done the best, are on the highest levels, are, and I have to read it because I forget exactly, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, Vermont, and New Hampshire, which are all bargaining states. And the lowest states in terms of the index of academic achievement from Education Week are Louisiana, New Mexico, West Virginia, the District of Columbia, and Mississippi. Those are all non-bargaining states with the limited exception of the District of Columbia, which has very limited bargaining rights. So if there's an analysis that you can draw or a conclusion that you can draw from unionization of teachers and the performance of the districts where they work, the evidence is very clear that in unionized workplaces there are, in fact, positive consequences for student achievement. And we can go into lots of detail about why that might be, but I'm going to close there and say let's engage in dialogue.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So intense and rich. I want to make sure that we put on the other light, so we've got some light down at that end too. Thank you. It's off to your left. All right, so first question.
Reactions, comments.
Reactions, comments. Cecilia.
No, well, it seems to me like, I'm sorry, your name?
Douglas.
Douglas. So Douglas, you're sort of ending by saying that the answer, or the problem and the answer is that it's a fiscal reality, right? And so you're sort of closing it off there. And I'm hearing the last speaker actually, problematize and open that up and say, ask what is fiscal reality? So in a way you're accepting fiscal reality. You're saying the fiscal reality is that there's no more money, and we're saying, well, what is fiscal reality? It's constructed, in ways which actually politically shut down the amount of money that people have. And we're asking questions about those politics, but I'm hearing you kind of shutting down those questions, suppressing those questions. So
well,
I guess let me ask you a direct question, which is, why would you sort of suppress the questions, that are triggered by such a statement? Why do you accept fiscal reality?
Well, I guess I would answer that in two ways. First of all, I object to your characterization of my suppression of an issue, and I never said that. I answered the question. Now, the answer to your discrete question is bifurcated. The first answer is, why do I accept the fiscal reality? What's my choice when I go to the bargaining table? I don't have more money. I have to. The second answer is, I think Pauline's right. The property tax cap that was imposed on this state is, I think your wording is correct, the most draconian. We're being filmed, so I won't use a more direct word, but it's ridiculous to tell a school board that it can't increase taxes, but more to tell the voters that they're not allowed to vote and approve an increase in taxes is patently absurd. It is. Should it be changed? It never should have been passed in the first place. Having said that, I can say that till I'm blue in the face when I'm negotiating a contract, it doesn't give me more money. So do I accept the fiscal reality? In the position I sit in, I have to, because I don't have more money. Do I think at the policy level it was right? Absolutely not.
Okay. John?
I guess this is sort of a question for both Doug and Pauline, sort of both sides of this. So I'm hearing from you, Doug, that the union is kind of not as aware, or is being kind of unreasonable, right? They're not as aware of the fiscal constraints. Help me understand. Does that help you understand why some states would be seeking to get rid of collective bargaining? How do you? Because one thing I can understand, you're sort of bargaining and you're dealing with that. is there a moment in which the logic of this unfolds to say, now I get it, why should we have collective bargaining if they can't be reasonable?
My grandfather was in the meat packers union, and I believe he needed to be. I believe they needed a union there to protect his rights and his safety and his welfare as a worker. I'm not anti-union. I don't want anyone to walk away from here thinking that. I think the unions have a place and they do good work, and I think to be quite candid with you, Pauline's organization puts out some very high quality information, both from a professional development standpoint for teachers as well as from a policy level. And I know I have many friends that work at the union, and I think they do great work. I am not anti-union. What I'm saying is, when I'm at a discrete local level, and there's a difference, and I think it's important, particularly as we sit in an academic institution, to understand that what we can discuss at the academic level is different than what actually takes place in the field. So when I'm sitting at a bargaining table and I'm asking a union not to take a raise and I'm told no, there's a frustration there, and there's a cost associated with that. And that cost, unfortunately, has to be that we're going to lay off the least senior teachers if I can't balance my budget.
But another piece of that is that when you're sitting at the bargaining table and you're telling them no because of the budget, you've been sitting at the bargaining table with that same person opposite with you every maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe for 20 years. Maybe you don't like them personally, maybe you do, maybe you went to the same law school with them. It's an ongoing relationship, so
Sure.
This isn't even happening in isolation where we can say, well, we'll just agree the facts and then we'll get to a conclusion. This is something where the relationship matters, and there might be leftovers from grievances that happened in this during the duration of the most recent contract. There might be just personality issues. There's all kinds of things. Some people won't like it that Doug's there at all because they want their management, not their management's lawyers speaking, right? So just as the union some people want the union's local representatives, and some people want their professional staff there. So it's not just a matter of can you agree on the facts, or are the facts in dispute. There's this whole personality and relationship aspect that can, again, make it occasionally easier, but more likely much more difficult.
My comment on this is that I see the contract settlements for the teacher locals as well as school support personnel who we also represent. We represent virtually all public school teachers in New York State. And so I see the contract settlements, the terms of contract settlements as they are being negotiated and ratified. And I will tell you that notwithstanding the experience that Douglas is describing, there are very large numbers of teacher locals which have agreed to reopen existing contracts and do contracts concessions in order to avoid layoffs and loss of programs and services in their districts. There are many, many school districts where the teacher locals have agreed to waive step increases for some portion, at least, of the collective bargaining agreement's term, and they have agreed to zeros. And they have agreed to increases in their health insurance costs, the share that they pay for health insurance. And I will tell you that while it sounds as though, okay, people are getting step increases and they're not losing money, the reality is, they're in many, many places, the teachers are accepting no step increase for periods of time or deferred step increases, which reduces, obviously, the amount of increase they receive, and they're accepting increased costs for their health insurance, which is actually resulting in a reduction in their net pay. So this is happening. The bargaining process is working, in my opinion. And I should comment that one of the things that happened in Wisconsin was that Walker said he needed to make these changes in the collective bargaining law in order to save money. And at the table, what happened was the concessions were made, financial concessions were made, which addressed the issues that he had identified, and he still wanted the modifications in the collective bargaining law. This is really not about money. It's about power. It's about a voice in the workplace. That's really what it's about.
And Pauline's right. There are a lot of units that were very successful negotiating, and teachers are willing to give up, and they ultimately do get an increase in their pay, but they've given stuff up, so the increase is less than it would have been had it simply been a step increase. And I'm not disputing that at all. We are somewhat hamstrung by provisions of the law if those concessions don't take place. And you know, what Rebecca mentions is certainly a valid element to the entire equation. It's a personnel endeavor. It's a very personnel-intensive endeavor. I have been on the union side of things at the table negotiating against a Board of Education with a board member saying, I am not going to be here if that lawyer is going to be here. And I sat in my car in the parking lot. So it can happen, but it's resolvable because that guy felt he got his pound of flesh because I sat in my car in the parking lot. So it can happen, and you're right. There are personality issues and there's things to get around, but you know, it's not a perfect process. But the law definitely, and I'm not going to waver on this, the law that allows the employees to continue the benefits until successor benefits are negotiated hamstrings the negotiating process from the management side of things.
I just wanted to jump in on an earlier point that Douglas made about professionals and unions and whether there's a conflict between teachers as professionals and as union members. I would strongly disagree that there's a conflict, and I think there's plenty of professionals that are very well represented by their unions, including doctors, lawyers, nurses are represented by many unions. They're one of the biggest, fastest growing areas of unions. Boeing engineers, college and university faculty. There are all kinds of professionals, and their unions are doing all kinds of things for them, not only ensuring the quality of their product, whether that product is a healthy patient or a safe plane, but they're protecting them from their clients, nurses, people who work in healthcare where clients can be violent or difficult or abusive. They're doing all kinds of really important things, and there's no inherent conflict in being a union member and having a union to advocate for you and to bargain for you and being a professional.
Yes, sir. I'm curious if I could ask a question, and I apologize, Professor, I'm looking through everyone. Christine, your last name? No.
Me?
Yes.
Catherine.
I'm sorry. You said when you started, you introduced yourself and indicated you're here because you're appalled at how public perception of unions are. I'm curious, could you tease that out a little?
Yeah.
If I may be so bold as to...
I think the fact that, and again, this is not sort of empirical research, it bothers me when I hear people complain that public sector workers have pensions. That somehow having a pension means you're a fat cat. I find that appalling. And the fact that they get health benefits. That I will hear people complain that people are getting pensions and health benefits. So instead of people thinking, gee, maybe I ought to organize, or, you know, maybe my lot is the wrong thing. Maybe the fact that I've worked for 30 years and I have a 401k that will let me survive for about 6 months, because frankly, for people who are earning $30,000 a year, if you look at their 401ks,
yep,
they can survive for about 6 months, and then it's cat food and Social Security. So the fact that 15 years ago, I didn't hear people question pensions. People didn't say having a pension, you're somehow a criminal if you have a pension and health insurance. And that is now in the language of people. And I think that's outrageous. And I don't know what we're going to do about this, but I think there's
Working on it,
this
working on it.
paradigm shift that's going on, which is very negative, and I'm not sure how to rethink it so that people say, wait a minute, we ought to have a pension, and how do we get them? Maybe it's through collective bargaining and more unionization, maybe it's something else. Well, that's what's bothering me, is the new narrative.
There's been some good public opinion data in the last year and a half since, Wisconsin blew up. And it shows that the public opinion of unions is favorability, it's kind of done as a favorability poll, is pretty mixed. It's around 50% positive. It's, whether that's what you would think or not. Public opinion, if it's asked as should workers have the right to collective bargaining, or should public sector workers have the right to collective bargaining, it's very, very high, 60, 70 more percent. So part of it is, as always, how you ask the question. Just like, a lot of parents will be angry with teachers' unions, but they love their kids' classroom teachers, right? It's the same kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, yeah.
Damn legislators, damn teachers, but everybody loves their own.
I just wanted to add an addendum to your comments about, I mentioned when I introduced myself, I'm a retired public employee. I worked as a caseworker for Onondaga County for over 30 years. And one of the things the public sometimes forgets is that as a public employee, my pay scale for for my level of education and experience compared to the private sector was always lower, much lower sometimes than, like I mentioned, the private sector. So obviously we gave that up in lieu of getting a decent pension. It's not an extravagant pension, but it's decent. And I think, you know, with that Social Security, I can do okay. But we did give all that up over the years as a public employee, that more comfortable yearly increase in income, more comparable income to a private sector person with the same type of employment as I might have had as a social worker, quote unquote, but not in the private sector, let's say.
Question over here?
Yeah, well, I have several comments, if that's okay. The first thing I wanted to say is I really think that the kind of the anti-union discourse actually is perpetuating the lack of funding that is afforded to schools, because people are starting to buy into the idea that we shouldn't be giving public money, all of those things. So that's one comment I have. The other thing that really bothers me is that is often ignored is just the inequity of funding between schools in New York State. I think that's a really huge issue.
Yep.
I think that the discourse of pitting students against teachers is a really, really big problem. And this is a lot of stuff I'm finding in my dissertation, but the whole idea of reform right now is we need to improve instruction, we need to improve teacher quality, and there's so much more to it, and student demographics are ignored completely. I'm hearing a lot of this from the interviews I did, especially from people at higher levels. And so I think we need to start, and there's absolutely no research based to any of the reforms that are being put out right now. And then I think also, we say that it's in order to give students what they need, we have to change the way teaching is happening, but in fact, students are really being negatively affected, and this is especially so for students who, for instance, students with disabilities, students who, have English as a second language. Those are and then, students in urban, high poverty schools. And so, the ramifications I just think are so huge. So I guess, how does diversity and how does inequities come into the conversation?
That was addressed, and
We had a good luncheon.
Well,
I think it's a crucial issue, absolutely.
It is a crucial issue, and the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case that took better than a decade to resolve. I was going to say to you, haven't you read the CFE case? It's resolved. We have equity.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, a group of small city school districts are now about to be heard at the Court of Appeals in the preliminary stages of their own lawsuit of the very same ilk, relying on CFE heavily, saying, we're now not getting equity. You implemented foundation aid. This was the result of this huge equity fiscal distribution of assets in the state, and it's not working for us anymore.
Well, there's a reason why it's not working for us anymore. And by the way, NYS did support that litigation.
Yeah.
And is involved. I think we're filing an amicus brief in the small city school
Yeah,
case.
and I think school boards is too. That's like arm in arm, and it's
because we believe
trouble.
in inequity in school funding, and it is incredibly inequitable. New York is one of the worst, if not the worst, state in the country on school funding inequities. But the point here is that the foundation aid, which was the result of that Court of Appeals decision, was funded as it was agreed upon for 2 years.
Yeah. And then it was suspended.
And then it's been it's totally disassembled because there was no money to pay the
so it's
foundation
like suspended
aid.
for the past 2 years.
So the reality, since 2008 I think it is. So the reality here is that even though the New York State Court of Appeals made a finding that the state government had violated the New York State Constitution by failing to provide the funding for a sound basic education, that's quote out of the Constitution, they're still not funding it. They're still not funding it, and it's an outrage.
It is.
And the combination of these circumstances makes it even more outrageous, because there are too many people who do a lot of talking about how, I'm a friend of education, I believe in the public schools, I'm the lobbyist for students. And where's the money? Show me the money.
And I'll
and
just
that's an
say
issue.
two things which came up when we were talking at lunch that could mitigate, but mostly just perpetuate the inequalities. One is that the the schools that have wealthier parents, the parents are putting in money, so they're having smaller classes or music and art, etc. And then the other thing is based on what I might say is something resembling a beauty contest, foundation money and sometimes corporate money is going in, especially the charter schools, right? And so you just get, there's not an increase to the pot of money that gets distributed through a reasonable, say, per student mechanism, but there's all these other ways that money is going into the system that's helping in the areas that get it, but it doesn't help the system at all, and it often just perpetuates inequalities.
And I mean, like $8 million of the, I mean, I was just at the Syracuse City School District budget meeting. You know, like $8 million of that is tied to having to put in teacher evaluations. Like they can't even use that money, so they're like being held hostage to put into place these reforms.
Getting back to something you had mentioned, you made a good point that the pensions and the benefits and retirement for public employees is somewhat of a manifestation of the fact that when you went into public employment, you really didn't get paid what a private sector job paid. And I think that that's it's an important point to remember. I think something else to consider is that that doesn't necessarily retain the same truth today. And
you can look at, Jeff Keefe has done this both nationally and for almost every state, and whether you look at just pay or at total compensation, which takes into account health and benefits, public sector workers are undercompensated by occupation and education compared to private sector workers. The only area where that is not the case, and this is a minority of public sector workers, is those with only a high school education. And even that is only if you look at the whole compensation package. They are slightly compensated at a slightly higher rate. But if you look at people with some college, with a college degree, or in the case of teachers, primarily with a master's degree, even when you do the total compensation, and you can look at that, if you go to Economic Policy Institute and look at Jeffrey Keefe, you'll see it, he's done maybe 15 states where he's actually done the state level data, and he's also got a national aggregate document. You can download all that stuff, but it's still.
And if I was able to at least finish my sentence, I would have said that the 2009 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that if you combine the overall rate of pay for public and private sector employees, that it's considerably higher for the public sector employees when you factor in those additional benefits in the health insurance and total compensation, to the tune of roughly $40 an hour versus something more in the line of $27 an hour.
But it's meaningless without doing it by level of education.
Well, statistics will tell you exactly what you want them to, but the broader point is when you hear about pensions and when you hear about health insurance, there are difficulties with that, and they're financial as well as just reality. Most teachers will receive health insurance in retirement at the level that they had it when they left employment. That's not something you typically see in the private sector. And that's a drain, and there's not a great deal that can be done about it. In fact, one of my school districts tried to do something about it by making a slight diminishment in the retiree health benefits, which was commensurate with the current employee benefits, and we're now in the middle of litigation on it because we got sued, even though the law allows us to do that. So there are difficulties with that, and I think that it's not you get your pension. I don't want you to not have your pension. I don't want you to not have your health insurance. But those are big costs for schools that have limited resources.
One thing to add, though, is that in New York State, at least, they've added more tiers over the years.
Sure.
And it's accelerated in a sense, too, in terms of what year the new tiers have been added. Tier 5 came off about, what, three years ago?
Right. Tier 5 never should have been instituted, though.
Yeah, well, but that's been happening. Yeah. That makes it more costly for the employee overall.
Right.
When he gets compensated for it.
Can I ask about maybe Pauline about teacher evaluation, because I know that there is a new system in New York, and that the unions worked with the governor to create that new system. So sometimes there's a perception that teacher unions are against evaluation, and clearly that's not the case here. So I wondered if you could speak to that.
Sure. Back in 2010, we sat down with then Governor Patterson and the state education department to work on a teacher evaluation law. Prior to that, we had been working on collaborative efforts at local levels around the state on the whole issue of teacher evaluations, peer assistance, trying to help teachers improve where they were stumbling. But in 2010, we worked with the State Education Department and the Governor's Office to put together legislation which would establish a new teacher evaluation law. Frankly, there are aspects of it that are very difficult for our members to accept. They are very concerned about the reliability and validity of some of the components of the teacher evaluation law, but we are giving our best shot at making it work and having it be a system that is a uniform system across the state. It's a composite score system. It's 4 categories of ratings: highly effective, effective, developing, and ineffective. Any teacher who receives either a developing or ineffective rating is entitled to a teacher improvement plan, which provides details about where the areas of concern are and how they can improve, whether it's by a variety of different means, mentoring, observing other teacher coaches, all kinds of other opportunities, as well as professional development opportunities, to try to improve that score, that rating. I can tell you that the area of controversy that is most difficult for our folks to accept is how the composite score is arrived at. 20% of it must be based on the growth in student test scores. Okay? There are state assessments for 3 through 8 ELA and math, which are taking place right now and next week. And the teachers who teach the elementary grades through 8th grade in ELA and English language arts and math will receive a growth score based upon the expectation of what the students in their class should be getting in terms of an increase in their test scores compared to a similar cohort from last year. So that's 20% of your score out of 100 possible points. The second 20% of the score is based upon other measures of student performance, and that can be any one of a number of different things, but we're talking about something called student learning objectives and calibrating student learning objectives and how well students perform on meeting the expectations of the objectives that are identified at the beginning of the year. So that's another 20%. So 40% of a teacher's evaluation will be based upon student growth or specific student performance measures. The remaining 60% to get to 100 is based on essentially a rubric of New York State teaching standards. There are a whole bunch of them, and which will be scored for each teacher on the basis of the teacher's ability to produce a portfolio or other evidence of meeting expectations with respect to the teaching standards, and a minimum of 2 observations by an administrator, one of which has to be unannounced, and 31% of the 60% has to be based on observations. The remaining 29% can be based on other ways of assessing the teacher's performance. But this is a complicated, very complicated system. We have a lot of concerns because we have concerns about the reliability and the validity of the student testing. The tests keep changing, the curriculum keeps changing, so year-to-year comparisons are very, very difficult to make fair. And dealing with the whole issue of developing student learning objectives and just figuring out whether or not they've been met. A lot of subjectivity involved in that, a lot of judgment, exercise of judgment, and there's a lot of worry that the teacher evaluations will not be, here's my word, fair. There are consequences to teacher evaluation scores that are ineffective. If there are 2 consecutive annual reviews that are ineffective, after there's been an opportunity for an appeal and review of whether that was the right rating on the first one, if there's a second one that is ineffective, the teacher is subject to an expedited disciplinary proceeding, which could result in their termination.
Exiting.
Exiting, that was my, But and I just wanted to add, so this is it's a labor-intensive process. It's been, but a lot of developing the process was labor intensive. A lot of work.
The
and thought was put
implementation
into
is
it.
by far more
But
difficult.
That, which sounds like about as holistic as you can get, is not satisfactory to ALEC or these foundation-funded things like the National Council on Teacher Quality, who want over 50% test scores.
Well,
So
in
it's just-
Tennessee, they had a system in place where more than I think 51% of the teachers' evaluation was based on student test scores, and they discarded it because it was so completely at odds with what
they knew
the
about the teachers.
common sense knowledge of the teacher's performance, that they've discarded it and are working on a whole different system. So I mean, the issue of relying on student test scores and of course student test scores are, you know, high stakes, one shot kinds of things that can be misleading at
I think it's also
And then you, John.
important to note that schools that are now persistently low achieving are already subject to doing the evaluations, which, you know, it just makes things worse. They're not fully formed. Nobody's can figure out how it's working, and you know, the teachers can have negative consequences.
Yep.
And you know, those schools are already inequitably under subject around AYP and all of those things. So I think that's, you know, I think that's a really bad.
Yeah, and there are a number of factors that are not adequately taken into consideration, like student absenteeism, you know, other kinds of factors. They are supposed to be building in factors having to do with English language learners, students with disabilities, and high poverty, but how and to what extent that's going to be reflected in the expectations of improvement in student test scores is still to be established.
John and then Gretchen.
This is a question for Robin, but I guess I'm sorry?
Rebecca.
Rebecca, sorry.
That's all right.
But that maybe Pauline could talk about this also. And I appreciate, Doug, that you're not anti-union, and that's reassuring. But I'm trying to understand is comparatively, when we think about Wisconsin and New York, what should reassure us about the situation in New York that the really dangerous position should unions, where it's not just, you know, arguing about this or that part of the pie, but the very right to exist becomes at stake. Why should we be assured that in New York that won't happen?
You're asking me to argue that position?
I'm trying to understand sociologically.
I don't.
New York, I mean,
the difference between New York State and Wisconsin is that we have New York City and they have Madison as our labor cities, right? And so New York City is huge. The population of Wisconsin is not as weighted towards an urban, more pro-labor area as the statewide population of New York is, because New York City is so huge. I think that right-wing politicians in rural areas of New York would do the same as right-wing politicians in rural areas of Wisconsin. It's just more heavily tempered by the size and the voting prowess of New York City. The starting point is not that different. Wisconsin is a traditionally strong, powerful union state, just like New York. This is not something where we're talking about, you know, South Carolina or, I mean, you know, it's not something where you're saying, oh, they don't have a labor history there, the unions never had much to do anyway. So in that sense, the starting point is the same. I would say the difference is just the size of New York City compared to, you know, Madison and Milwaukee are not anywhere near as big in numbers, but that's not a great deal.
That reassure you, Pauline?
But one thing I'd like to make sure that people know is that there is a recall that has been, 900,000 signatories to the recall petition, put that on the ballot June 4th or 8th. Do you remember?
Coming up soon.
But there is a recall, that's going to be election that's going to take place June 4th or 8th.
And actually,
along with
one of the
other
things
officials.
that was encouraging to the labor movement was Ohio, right? And that was a huge risk. I mean, the labor movement threw everything into that ballot initiative to quickly undo a very anti-union law. And, labor movement hasn't done so well in Ohio lately. It's been struggling with presidential elections, with senators, with everything else, and it really put a lot of resources in there to try to get SB 5 repealed, and it succeeded. So, you know, it's still got the ability to sometimes succeed at the ballot box, but.
I would argue that, that there's been some lessons learned from Wisconsin and Ohio by legislators and governors, and that is direct attacks, frontal attacks, big scale attacks, not a good idea. It's really more about kind of nibbling around the edges that doesn't cause people to rise up in outrage, but nevertheless has a significant impact on the labor movement. And so I think that that's the direction that a lot of states are likely to go in, and I don't see New York as being substantively different from other states which have had a long history and commitment to the labor and unionization. Obviously, if there's a change in the governor or whatever happens, it could happen here too. I see there's no guarantee that it wouldn't happen here.
One slight wild card is that ALEC is rapidly moving. So there were all these corporations that were ALEC members, ALEC funders.
Yeah,
like
they pulled
a
out.
lot of them were things like fast food, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and they were in there for a single issue, which would be something like soda taxes. But they were paying their dues to the whole organization, which was then going and working on voter ID laws and stand your ground. And a lot of corporations just in the last week have pulled out. Now ALEC has a lot of individual philanthropic supporters and donors, but so whether that funding difference will matter, ALEC is now out there, and every time a law is introduced or a bill is introduced that seems to be inspired by ALEC, I still have enough confidence in the media that they're going to go through it. They just did it in New Jersey. I think it was the Star Ledger really went through everything with a fine-tooth comb and said, let's see what came out of ALEC bill. So I think that's a rapidly moving thing. I wouldn't predict which way it's going to go, but whereas in the past there have been hundreds of laws passed that came right out of ALEC language that no one had ever heard of ALEC or knew to even go look at the laws. So that, I'm not saying where it'll end up, but I think it's moving quickly.
The other thing about New York is, I don't know if the governor is as worker-friendly as we had hoped. I'm involved with the Working Families Party. We had a big debate during the campaign whether even to endorse it. We ended up doing that, but many, myself, did not like that at all. And I think it's shown as we've seen things happening that we should not have endorsed it.
Okay, Gretchen, I think you have the last question.
Great. First of all, I have a comment and then I have a particular question. The comment is about the title for the event, the Public Employees Under Siege. And I guess I just want to push back a little bit on your insistence that in fact they're not under siege. And I just want to do so by highlighting again the data that Rebecca provided about the concerted political effort across 28 states to roll back collective bargaining for employees. I think in face of that, in conjunction with the rhetorical attacks against teachers and public sector workers, it's really hard. I think it's really hard to make the case that public sector workers are not under siege. But the question I actually have is, I was curious to know, Rebecca, if you can talk a little bit about what happened in Indiana, because there was so much attention to Wisconsin and Ohio. And Indiana passed this right to work legislation, and nobody really knew anything about it. So I'm wondering if you have some insight as to why that passed so easily without any.
I mean, the labor movement is much smaller than it's been ever, basically, I mean, in a long time. And it has limited resources, and it's not used to operating in a quick, agile way. So the fact that they were able to get people out in Wisconsin and in Ohio quickly was a success, and not necessarily one that could be counted upon. I think what happened in Indiana was something, the kind of thing that Pauline was talking about, where taking away collective bargaining rights is people, especially if they have a teacher in their family, which most people do because there are a lot of teachers around, understand something about that, even if they don't really understand what collective bargaining is. Right to work gets to that. What is that? That doesn't sound. I don't know if I disagree or disagree.
Right to work.
You know, it's much harder to turn people out against that, and they really did a good job framing it as a economic development strategy, nothing to do with workers' rights, just attracting companies to our state, which we desperately, desperately need. So they did a really good job framing. The union's resources were already spread thin, and it's an issue that didn't hit as many sort of the public sector workers, who we know there are more of, or more in unions as directly. So I think it was a number of things, but I think timing was part of it. That, you know, the labor movement was spread very thin at that point.
Okay. I want to thank the panelists so much for a wonderful presentation.